The last president of independent Estonia from before the Soviet occupation in World War II, Konstantin Pats, had died in prison in 1956, but his remains had been discovered near Tver in June 1990 and were repatriated to Tallinn in late October at the expense of the Soviet state and reburied at the Metsakomistu cemetery. Estonia remained in an odd position, still nominally part of the USSR, but increasingly asserting its own identity as a separate nation, and this gesture seemed to be another sign that under Gorbachev, the Soviet state was trying to accommodate rather than repress national feelings. Elsewhere, the Russian city of Gorky reverted to its previous name of Nizhny Novgorod. Maxim Gorky was an influential political thinker and writer who'd been born in the city in 1868, and the city was named after him on his death in 1936. In fact, so influential was he that thousands of streets, towns, villages and institutions were named after him, including Gorky Park in central Moscow. Nizhny Novgorod had been far from the only Soviet city, of course, to be named after a great man of Marxist history. Stalingrad had quietly become Volgograd back in 1961, as the Soviet government tried to distance itself from the dictator. But even the city fathers of Leningrad were said to be considering reverting to St. Petersburg, or possibly Petrograd, which was the Russified version of the name used during World War I, as the original sounded a bit too German. Over in the tiny mountainous Kyrgyz Republic, meanwhile, which had seen ethnic riots earlier in the year between Kyrgyz and Uzbek groups, the Supreme Soviet had decided to institute the post of President of the Republic. 2 candidates entered, but neither managed to secure enough votes to proceed to the next round, so after a couple of days of deadlock, they chose a third option, selecting Azkar Akayev, an academic and engineer who had been a deputy in the Supreme Soviet only since last year. It was election season around the world, with Pakistan electing Nawaz Sharif of the Pakistan Muslim League to replace the Pakistan People's Party led by Benazir Bhutto after 2 years in power. Bhutto's success in 1988 came with high expectations of democratic change after the dictatorship of Zia-ul-Haq, but the government had been brought down over allegations of corruption and failure to deal with rising lawlessness, and while the corruption charges were never actually proven, the PPP and the other parties in their alliance were heavily defeated. Over in New Zealand, there was another heavy defeat for the incumbents, as the Conservative National Party inflicted the widely expected heavy defeat on Labour in a landslide. Labour leader Mike Moore, Prime Minister for just 60 days after taking over from the unpopular Geoffrey Palmer, stayed as leader of the party as they went into opposition, while new PM Jim Bolger would have a tough job. Just 3 days after being sworn in, the new government had to bail out the Bank of New Zealand to the tune of $380 million before having to borrow $740 million once they'd hastily rewritten the budget. An election would also be needed in Norway, where the issue of the country's relationship to Europe, and particularly the impact of membership of the proposed European Economic Area on Norwegian sovereignty, brought down the Conservative government of Jan Per Syse after just under a year in office. And a few days after the Australian Grand Prix, Ireland elected its first female president, Mary Robinson. The Fianna Fáil party had produced all 6 presidents since the post was created in 1938, and their candidate, Brian Lenihan, was regarded as the favourite to win in 1990, but after a scrappy and sometimes personal campaign, Robinson won with 51.9% of the vote to become the first woman and first Labour politician to head the Irish Republic. And so to Australia, where for the 500th World Championship Grand Prix there was no change to the field from Suzuka, except for a new lower friction version of the Renault engine in the backs of the Williams cars. Of course, most of the fortnight since the race in Japan had been occupied with endless discussions of the first corner incident between Senna and Prost that had decided the title in the former's favour. For all that Senna continued to insist that it had simply been a racing incident and he had wanted to win the race just as he wanted to win every race, many believed that he had been taking revenge for Prost's move on him the previous year. While Alain was hardly about to admit there was anything to take revenge for, he certainly had not been shy about voicing his criticism.
You've had 2 weeks to think about it. Do you think that he deliberately crashed into you?
Absolutely, 100%. And I have, a video here from the helicopter. I have the video from some people, and I never lie. I never lie to the press. I mean, very often it was against me because I said things were a bit rude, a bit difficult to understand for a lot of people. But I never lie, and I can tell you he has done 100% deliberately. That's what I don't accept. If there were only 1% chance, I would say, okay, there is a doubt, but it's not even 1% because it was a corner where I'm flat, you know, in 5th gear, and the only way he could do something, he cut the corner and he hit my wing, the rear wing. But we reached a point where it's going to be very, very difficult to work very well. That's why I said, you know, after Japan, I still feel the same. I'm thinking of or retiring or to do something.
Really? You're really thinking of that?
Yeah, because it's, what can I do? I mean, you know, I have some children, and it is very bad for me to feel sometimes that my child, who is now 9 years old, could think that I am a bad boy, you know, I do something wrong in the sport, and they don't understand.
The handshakes and reconciliations after Monza in September seemed a very long time ago indeed. And he wasn't alone, no less a luminary than Jackie Stewart, in town for the celebrations as well as working for Channel 9 in Australia, opined that Senna seemed to be having altogether too many accidents for a driver of his calibre, implying that he was at least reckless if not actively cynical. James Hunt, meanwhile, over on the BBC, was firmly in Senna's corner, saying Prost seemed to be suffering some kind of nervous breakdown. At the driver's briefing, Ron Dennis asked what seemed an innocuous question about what would happen if the chicane was missed, at which Prost stood up and walked out. And when Hunt, Stewart and other former champions Denny Hume, Sir Jack Brabham and Juan Manuel Fangio assembled with Piquet and Senna for commemorative photos, Alain was conspicuous by his absence, also refusing to be in the end-of-term group drivers photo, and seemed pensive and out of sorts around the paddock. Another man missing from the group photo was Australia's other world champion Alan Jones, who was actually in Adelaide but was a bit busy driving a Ford Sierra in the Australian Touring Car Championship, which formed one of the support races. He remained the only Aussie to have entered a Championship Australian Grand Prix, driving for Haas Lola in 1986, but young David Brabham would be hoping to make that too if he could just buck his recent form of only qualifying for every other race. Given his illustrious father, and the founder of the team he was driving for, was very much in evidence in the paddock and the entire Australian media were talking about him, the pressure to do so was intense. For most of the rest of the paddock the pressure was off, though there was still a four-way battle for third place in the Drivers' Championship, currently held by Gerhard Berger, but with Piquet, Mansell and Boutsen all vying for the place, while the Austrian was really hoping to finally break his McLaren duck and to prevent this from being the first year since 1985 in which he didn't win a race. And of course both Senna and Prost had a point to prove. F1's latest double champion had never won in Australia, but seemed determined to do something about that, dominating every session and smashing the lap record to take his 50-second pole just over half a second quicker than his teammate who joined him on the front row. Mansell in his last race for Ferrari had the satisfaction of outqualifying Prost, with his replacement a lazy 5th, recovered from his neck strain but now suffering from a bout of the flu, alongside Patrese, with Piquet and Moreno on row 4, ahead of Boutsen and Martini making up the top 10, with Warwick just outside in 11th, alongside an excellent Larini. Johnny Herbert in the second Lotus was back in 18th, complaining of oversteer, and lining up alongside Alio in his last race for Ligier. Guillard put in a good performance in the Ilzella to qualify 22nd, the two LaRousse Lolas were on row 12, with David Brabham delighted to make the race in 22nd, ahead of Tarquini, meaning Arrows would have a double DNQ as their last result before becoming footwork next year, alongside Dalmas and Bertrand Gachot, making it 16 failures to qualify out of 16 and a second and a half behind the next slowest car. Unlike last year, the sun was blazing down with track temperatures soaring, and teams had to decide whether to stick with the planned softest D compound tyres or move up to the slightly harder C compound, which should last better. McLaren went for the latter option, while Ferrari stuck with the original plan. Time would tell who was right. The green lights went on, and we were off, with Mansell moving over to defend third from Prost, but everyone making it into the first chicane in more or less grid order. Senna leading Berger, Mansell, Prost and Alesi. Piquet took fifth partway around the first lap, while Moreno had dropped behind the two Williamses, but already Senna was building up a lead, with Berger beginning to drop back, 1.7 seconds behind at the end of lap 1. Was he deliberately holding the Ferraris up? It didn't matter. At Stag Turn on lap 2, he accidentally bumped the engine's safety kill switch. He had enough momentum to bump start it again, but not before Mansell was through and off in pursuit of Senna. Whether deliberately or not, Berger was definitely holding up Prost and Piquet, which became Piquet and Prost on lap 3 as the Benetton went by at the end of the straight. Piquet was having a great time, apparently revitalised by his win in Japan and having been fastest through the speed traps that morning. He quickly began to reel in Berger and bullied his way past on lap 9. He was over 4 seconds behind Mansell, who was in turn 1.8 seconds behind Senna, but Piquet was lapping faster than both of them. Mansell, of course, was on a charge of his own and caught right up to Senna by lap 11 of the 81, but Senna responded and the two set about exchanging fastest laps as they began lapping back markers. David Brabham, the first of these, followed by Tarquini and Guiar, having their own private battle, but on this occasion that proved no issue for the leaders, with Piquet now also heaving into view in the background. Larini had a lively trip over the curbs, but kept it running and rejoined. He was also driving his last race for Ligier, who had confirmed Boutsen and young French driver Eric Comas for 1991. Nonetheless, Larini could claim, so far at least, to have driven more racing miles than anyone else this season. David Brabham was less lucky, swapping ends at the first chicane after 13 laps and stalling his engine, while Patrese nearly came a cropper at the same spot, but kept it running. Was there oil on the track just there, or were the tyres beginning to go off? At any rate, Mansell was back with Senna again, and now harrying him for the lead, but Ayrton wasn't letting him get quite close enough. The pair passed Nakajima, Senna's old teammate and last year's fastest lap holder in the monsoon conditions, who had pitted. Sartori made Senna work for it, the Tyrrell's still pretty handy around street circuits, while Mansell was able to blast through on the straight but still seemed no closer to Senna, while the pace of the pair of them was such that they'd left Piquet far behind once again. Gugelmin's left front brake locked up on him on lap 27, depositing him in a sand trap, just retirement number 6, joining David Brabham, both Larousse Lolas, Suzuki transmission lap 7, Bernard gearbox lap 22, Morbidelli gearbox lap 21, and De Cesaris electrics lap 24. Mansell had dropped a little behind Senna, but was still trading fastest laps with him, both breaking the race lap record held by Gerhard Berger's Turbo Ferrari in 1987 as they did so. As half-distance approached, then it was still Senna, Mansell, Piquet, Prost, Patrese and Boutsen in the top 6, the top 4 each separated by about 6 seconds. Alesi, having qualified well, wasn't feeling great with the combination of the flu and the heat, and had dropped back to 9th before getting out of shape at the hairpin and having to reverse back into the race just as Senna came round to lap Pirot and himself. Mansell was having more trouble, particularly with Olivier Guiard, who had stopped and was being lapped again, and had dropped several seconds on Senna as the half-distance lap began, and Roberto Moreno took his turn to set fastest lap, back in 8th and the last unlapped man. Mansell was pushing hard to catch Senna again, a bit too hard, as on lap 42 he missed his turning and shot off up on Escape Road, rejoining in a haze of tyre smoke right in front of Piquet. With his tyres rapidly going off, not helped by that spin turn, Mansell wasn't able to keep Piquet behind him for long, and the Benetton was through a lap later, quickly leaving the Ferrari behind, with Berger and Prost now approaching from behind too, as Mansell slithered around on the track. A 3-way scrap ensued, but only for a couple of corners before Mansell peeled in for new boots and rejoined 5th. So that meant it was Senna leading Piquet, then Berger 3rd, with Prost looking to get ahead of him. And now it was Berger's turn to have a wobble, going wide and letting Prost through into 2nd on lap 50, the Frenchman setting off after Piquet, who was some 10 seconds up the road, with Senna a further 20 seconds ahead of him. Mansell, meanwhile, on new boots was absolutely flying, regaining fastest lap and gaining on 4th place Berger. He caught the Austrian on lap 57, just as Nakajima became the latest man to fall victim to failing brakes, and lightly booped the unique nose of the Tyrrell onto the tyre wall. While we watched that replay, Mansell nipped past Berger and set off after Prost, an 11 seconds gap, and Prost himself was lapping faster than either of the Brazilians ahead of him. Nigel lapped the recalcitrant Guiard again, more hand gestures from the Brit, but wasn't shaking Berger as the race entered its final quarter. Meanwhile, Senna up front was lapping 7th place Patrese and had, as Murray Walker put it, less of a cushion to Piquet behind him than a full lounge suite. Mansell set the fastest lap, and then suddenly the cameras cut to a man in a red race suit and yellow crash helmet walking along the side of the track, taking off his gloves. A replay showed him coming round and then simply going straight on at paddock turn and burying his McLaren in the tyre wall. It looked like an uncharacteristic driver error, but in fact his gearbox had refused to select 2nd, and that was that. So, as Gabriele Tarquini made a sharp exit from his smoking AGS, Nelson Piquet was delighted to inherit the lead from his old rival's misfortune, having just lapped his teammate Moreno. He had a 10-second lead over Prost, who had an 8-second lead over Mansell, and with 20 laps to go, suddenly it all looked wide open, as both Ferrari drivers, for their own reasons, very much wanted that win, and Piquet was of course just as keen to sign off his season with 2 wins, and just managed to catch Guiar on the straight before he got stuck behind the extra-wide Azella through the infield section. Mansell was still flying, setting another new lap record as he caught Prost, who was lapping Moreno, who was in turn lapping Pirro. Prost also dealt with Guiar while Mansell was passing Pirro, and then Olivier, apparently not wanting to be gesticulated at for a third time, moved all the way over to let both Moreno and Mansell through, with Roberto also allowing Nigel through too. Despite the sudden outbreak of politeness, Mansell had lost 4.5 seconds on that lap and immediately set about recovering it. He set fastest lap again on lap 70, and then knocked another few tenths off it on lap 71. Soon he was right with Prost, getting the toe down the straight and just going past. Piquet, meanwhile, was also going quickly, responding to the Ferraris and with an 11-second lead with 10 laps to go. It was a tall order, but Mansell was going to give it a go anyway, hacking lumps out of the lead as the laps ticked down. And then a slight mistake by Piquet on lap 77, running wide at Brewery Bend, allowed Mansell right up behind as they went by Guiar again. So with 4 laps to go, it was going to be a cracking finish as they came round to lap Mansell's once and future teammate Patrese, driving in his 208th Grand Prix. Both were passed down the straight with no problems, as Prost copied Piquet's long route round Brewery, but all eyes were on the front of the race as the two men, great rivals as teammates at Williams in 1986 and 87, went at it hammer and tongs. Piquet was fastest through the speed traps, but Mansell then closed up through the infield. Lap 79, and Piquet set fastest lap with 2 to go. Try as Mansell might as they went round the final lap, he just could not get close enough to have a go. Stefano Modena hove into view to be lapped. Piquet went past. Mansell left it late and tried to use his toe to slingshot past Piquet too at the corner. He had to try, and it was a bit fortunate that he didn't hit the Benetton, but it was just not to be. Piquet won his second race of the season, with Mansell and Prost second and third, Berger fourth, and the Williamses fifth and sixth after another undistinguished race. And Moreno was just outside the points in seventh, ahead of a lazy. Nelson Piquet thus equalled Berger's points tally, taking third place in the championship with 2 wins to Berger's none, and indeed Nelson was the only driver other than Prost to lose points to the best 11 rule. Mansell finished 5th overall, better than he looked like doing midway through the season, and satisfyingly going just clear of the man he'd be replacing at Williams, Thierry Boutsen. Patrese's points likewise lifted him clear of his friend and compatriot Sandro Nannini, who was watching from hospital and doing much better, as was Martin Donnelly, who had now regained consciousness and was looking like he would make a full recovery with time. And that was it for 1990, another eventful season, another controversial championship, and an Australian Grand Prix that had proved yet again to be an absolute cracker. For the first time since 1987, McLaren had won less than half the races, even though they had still won the Constructors' title at a canter, and with Prost joined by the promising Alesi at Ferrari, Benetton and Piquet ending the season on a high, and Mansell rejoining Williams, it was looking good for a very competitive 1991.